Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the video. As you'd expect, we're going to be tackling today's gaming and tech news, or at least some of it. The more interesting pieces, don't you know? There have been a couple of interesting developments from both AMD and Nintendo. Nintendo's NX specifications have supposedly emerged, at least some indications of the level of performance of the system, and we also have some information on AMD's Bristol Ridge lineup of processors. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the codename of Bristol Ridge, they're going to be the next generation of AM4 APUs. Now, these APUs, assuming this rumour slash leak slash whatever is accurate, they'll actually be ridiculously powerful. Essentially, they're going to feature 16 CUs, which means up to 1024 stream processors. If you want a desktop equivalent of that, think somewhere along the lines of an HD 7850. In other words, it's not necessarily something you're going to be able to play 4K at 60 FPS, but it's going to do a pretty darn respectable job at, let's say, 1080p with most settings at pretty high levels. Now, as you'd expect, because it's part of the AM4 platform, we should see a release date of around June-ish, at least assuming nothing slips. And it should be rather obvious at this point that the biggest issue of this potential APU is memory bandwidth. At the moment, we are on DDR3 for most folks. There are some who are, say, running Skylake, who are running DDR4, but most desktop PCs, if you've got something Haswell or below, is certainly going to be DDR3. But the next generation systems, including AM4, are certainly going to be utilizing DDR4. But even so, typically you're looking at around 50 gigabytes per second. This is assuming a dual channel solution. Obviously, bandwidth can be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, depending on the memory type that you're using, and how tight you've got the timings and how much you decide to overclock it. That type of thing is definitely going to affect performance. But even so, the bottom line is, let's say you've got an arbitrary figure of around 50-ish gigabytes per second, it's still considerably lower than 150-ish gigabytes per second that is featured on the 7850. But there could be some reasons behind this. One of them is we could see lower clocks on the actual GPU portion of the APU. So essentially, we could see a lower T-flop performance or maximum T-flop performance, which would of course mean that the total amount of bandwidth is required is less. Plus, as we all know, the latest iterations of the GCN architecture are much better at being efficient when it comes to memory bandwidth utilization. In other words, compression, that type of stuff, which can certainly squeeze down the amount of memory bandwidth which is required in comparison to without that compression. For example, as I've mentioned in a couple of our Tonga reviews, the graphics cards of course, memory bandwidth compression has essentially squeezed around 30-40% of extra performance with the same memory bandwidth, which is very similar of course to even Nvidia's own Maxwell architecture. This is actually kind of cool. And it isn't out of the realms of possibility. I mean, let's face it, the PlayStation 4 does actually have a very similar GPU to it. And in actuality, when you consider that a couple of the CUs that actually cut on the PlayStation 4's APU, you can start seeing how it's not really out of the realms of possibility. Moving away from the GPU side of things, despite the fact that we've just waxed lyrically about the damn thing, the rest of the APU is going to be made up of excavator cores, 4 of them to be precise, with 2 megabytes of level 2 cache. And of course, as you'd expect, the latest DDR4 memory standards will be supported, which is unsurprising given the bandwidth requirements that we've just explained. And we should also see support for HSA and all of the other general compute standards. So, moving on to Camp Mario, also known of course as Nintendo NX. So, the NX performance and what's actually under the hood has been subject of a lot of speculation, including ourselves at Red Gaming Tech. However, an interesting tidbit has just appeared. Now, you might be familiar with the username Geno. That's Geno. I'll repeat that, Geno. Now, this individual is the same source who leaked information regarding Pokemon, the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, and other shiny stuff. So in other words, theoretically, once again, if this is the same individual and all credentials pan out, they do have a good history. So, speaking to a website, Dual Pixels, Geno has actually given a rather lengthy quote. I'm going to read it out to you. Here we go. Basically, prepare thy anus. I don't have many details about the device itself, but I do have some background for it and some PR techniques they will use for it. A thing to note is the device has been, much of its production was started in 2014, and much of the stuff I listed here outlined by the late Satoru Iwata before his passing. Hence, in the company, the NX is considered the last project of the late president. Employees, since his passing, utter the phrase at the end of meetings and during idea brainstorms. There's Japanese kanji, but essentially it translates roughly to for Iwata. The importance of this is this new Nintendo is highly motivated by delivering fantastic system and games, something I quote from an employee, have not seen this much forward momentum or project since they launched the original Famicom. By the way, if you're alive back in the day of the Famicom, I was rather young at the time, but it was pretty much impossible to mention video games and not have Nintendo pop up into the minds and hearts of an individual. It was so much that you think Sony had a monopoly of, let's say, the PlayStation 2? No. The Famicom, yes, the numbers sold were lower than, let's say, the PS2, but in terms of mindshare, yeah. Anyway, so there are some piece of hardware information, and this is what the chap is divulging. It has a wireless HDMI dongle that attaches flush to the back of the device. A user can pull it out, insert it into any display that has a normal size HDMI output, and the device is used in an evolved version of the Wii U streaming tech to display the HD on the screen. Allegedly, the analog controls for the movement has small motors in them for full haptic feedback. Don't know if I feel that, because listen to this, meaning that if you run into a wall, the sticks move away from that direction to way to simulate running headfirst into it. This could also be used for jerking while firing a gun, taking damage, and moving over rough terrain, etc. It can literally Bluetooth sync with everything, especially for smartphones and tablets, to the point where one feature is that it answers phone calls and displays text messages from your phone on the screen, so you don't have to stop and answer from your smart device. That kinda cool. Anyway, the closest in terms of power it gets to the Xbox One, but an app idea is Wii U times 50 and PlayStation Vita times 100. The key is that all of the tech exactly the same level layout as the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, which means you can combine it with the OS's strong emulation functions, and compiler means you can run of a game on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, easily run on the NX with near zero modification of the original source code, especially if it runs in Android OS or Unreal Engine 4. This is allegedly why Nintendo has given out dev kits so late. As one third-party dev puts it, it's the easiest device we've ever developed for. You simply take your code, compile it, and it works. Look to Pokemon Go and you've got an idea of the social features that NX will take to the multiplayer, AR and Street Pass concepts to a whole new level. The real strengths of the device is its usability and ease of use. Developers have described to me that more than once it visually and functions as if Samsung and the Nintendo 2DS had a baby. And it looks friendly, but unlike what most of the people visualize a Nintendo device to typically look. The operating system, named Nintendo OS, that's Nintendo OS, alone is very powerful, so as many modern features of mobile gaming operating systems today, Nintendo is trying to be very careful in showing off in fear that it was mistaken for running Android. It also has very strong networking functions which tied it to multiple devices and services, allowing very competent and pervasive ecosystem design to constantly evolve inside the customers' lives. Jesus, that was a freaking long quote, but I did not want to not include it all because I think it's all rather important for context. Well, there's a lot of stuff we could go over there, isn't there? Yeah, a lot of stuff. I'm cool with the wireless HDMI. Really unsure about the haptic feedback for the analog stick. This comes from a person who really hates rumble functions in controllers. I fucking hate them. I know my opinion is not the popular opinion. I know some people love them and they, want to make love to them. I hate them with a lot of passion. I always, if you watch me play a lot of games, I'll disable the function. It's just how I just dislike it. I say that, however, but I've not tried this. So I'm going to go in skeptically, but I'm at least going to try it and say to myself, yeah, I'll try it and see what it's like. The Bluetooth sync with the text messages and so on, that could be bloody awesome. I mean, that is really cool. I'm not necessarily sure if it's something I'd use, personally, but I do not represent everyone. But I think it's cool. But the phone thing as well might be interesting in terms of being able to make phone calls. That could be kind of cool, especially if you've got a headset on already. That part I'd use. The closest in terms of power section where it said about the Xbox One, I could see that. Now, I won't lie, I had hoped it would be more powerful than the PlayStation 4 given the date that we're likely to see this surface, which is probably late this year. But let's say it's between the PS4 and Xbox One for sake of argument. That means it's still not bad. Ultimately, we don't have any indication of like the amount of memory, the amount of GPU performance, CPU performance, or even what the components are. I've said before and I'll say it again, I'm going to probably give AMD the benefit of the doubt for creating this. The reason, just because of what's been said about contracts, that type of thing. We know AMD have a relationship with Nintendo. It could, however, be ARM, or it could be Qualcomm. We could see bloody a version of a Snapdragon in there, for all I know. But hopefully not. The reason I don't think that is because they're saying it's essentially, with the architecture, it's essentially a PS4 Xbox One. So it would not make sense to make this, let's say, power PC. It would not make sense to make this ARM. It would not make sense to run this on a gerbil. It would make sense to run this on a regular x86 architecture, which once again emulates very closely the PS4 and Xbox One's architecture. That to me is easy to develop for. If you're running, let's say, Unreal Engine, it's not too difficult to modify your code. So what I'm hoping is essentially they've got a pretty simplistic layout. The Nintendo consoles of old have always had a kind of weird layout. The GameCube less so, but the N64, weird layout, particularly with the VRAM, or rather the RAM in general. And it had some problems with cache as well. Some of this is some of the reason that you see a lot of heavy fogging in the N64, along with some other issues as well, like fill rate. And the SNES had a notoriously slow CPU, but an absolute monster GPU. Well, not GPU, but video unit. So hopefully this system is fairly balanced. It's got a nice overall set of features, and developers can love it and snuggle it and make sweet love to it. It does appear, however, that they've learned their lesson. So it's me and Mario. Hello. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.